G'day team. So just quickly, we're going to talk about the vertebral column. Okay, so what we can see is that the vertebral column is comprised of 26 irregular bones. Okay, so remember irregular, we're talking about that the shape and how it appears, how it looks. So there's 26 irregular bones. Firstly, at the top we have the cervical. So that there are 7 bones in the cervical area. So C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. And then we go into the thoracic area, okay? And there's 12 of those, which is the one that attaches to our rib cage. So that's T1 to 12, 12 ribs, 12 vertebrae that have been assigned to that. Next, we have our lumbar. So that sits below that into our lower back. We have 5 vertebrae there. We have our sacrum, which has 5 vertebrae, and our coccyx has 4 vertebrae. But for the sacrum and the coccyx, they have been compressed and fused together to make 1 bone each. So there are 5 vertebrae in the sacrum fused together into 1 bone, and the coccyx has 4 vertebrae fused together into 1 bone. And the coccyx is also known as our tailbone. It has the remnant of a tail. Okay, so it's gone in, but it has that appearance. Okay, the bones of the spine are vertically aligned in such a way that there are a number of curvatures that are observable. Okay, so it runs vertically. Okay, so our spine is nice and straight, but when you turn us so that you're looking at us side on, you can see that there are curves within the spine, okay, which can be seen here. So when we're looking at it, this is the anterior view. So that means that we're looking at it from front on. So it would be, if you were to put a skeleton there, you'd be looking at them face to face. Okay, and then you can see here we have the right lateral view. So you can see the curvature of the spine in that diagram. Okay, so posteriorly concave curvatures, cervical and lumbar vertebrae, and posteriorly convex curvatures, thoracic and sacral. So what that means is that we have our cervical, so convex, it's going this way, concave, we're caving in, and then again, convex, we're caving out. So with our cervical and our sacrum, okay, so thoracic and sacral, we have that convex curvature, and then the cervical and the lumbar, we have that concave curvature. And these are just 3 of the spine curvature abnormalities. So scoliosis, kyphosis, and lordosis. One is a hunchback, one is a swayed back, and the other has an abnormal lateral curvature, okay? So with the anatomy of a vertebra, important to know, okay, because obviously we have a whole lot of different attachment points and we have a whole lot of different areas. So remember, this is the front anterior, that's the back posterior. So this area here is that ridge that you'd feel along your back, okay? So these 3 areas, if you run your fingers down your back, you can feel, in particular, that middle one running straight down the middle of your back, each little knock, okay? And that's called the spinous process. Then on the outside, we have our transverse processes. Through our hole, we have our vertebral foramen, and that is the area where our spinal column will run down. Through the area, we have this big, large surface area that's full, and that's called our body. We have the areas that articulate. So these are our superior articular processes. So what that means is that they are on top, our superior articular process. So superior on top, articular joint, or where they connect together with the other spine, the other vertebrae. So you can just imagine another vertebrae will be on top of this, another vertebrae will be on top of this. Okay, through here we have our vertebral arches. Okay, and these are important because they'll be, in some cases, through here is where our nerve endings will run out. And then these areas, these curved flat zones are called our lamina. All right, so a typical vertebra consists of the body, which is the weight-bearing region, the arch, which is encloses the vertebral foramen where the spinal cord passes. Our intervertebral foramina is the lateral openings between the vertebrae where the spinal nerves exit from, and then the processes, the spinal process, the inferior and superior articular processes. The spinous process project posteriorly, so that means that we can feel it coming out of the back, so it projects posteriorly, so directly behind us. The transverse processes, which are the ones that come out, they process laterally, so they process away from the midline, and those are the sites there for ligament and muscle attachment. And then our superior inferior articular processes, they are for where they form the joints where the other vertebrae will sit on top and the other vertebrae will sit on top and the other vertebrae will sit on top. Okay, so yeah, just there where you can see the lamina, the pedicle, and this here is the body. Okay, so just gives you an opportunity here that if you wanted to, you could be able to label them. Right, in our intervertebral disc, each vertebrae is separated by an intervertebral disc, which has a cushion-like pad. Okay, within the cushion-like pad, we have the nucleus pulpus that sits around the inside and the annulus fibrosus that sits around the outside. Okay, so the nucleus pulposus is the inner gelatinous nucleus that gives the disc elasticity and compressibility. So we can see in this diagram, this whole area in the middle is that inner gelatinous nucleus, all right? So it's just like a whole lot of jelly, and what it does is it gives it that ability to be able to absorb the weight, and that's will sit on top of the body of the vertebrae. All right, next we have the annulus fibrosus, and that surrounds the nucleus pulpus with a collar and compound of collagen and that fibrocartilage, and that's that shock absorber. And that will wrap nicely around it so that it can, it contains all that gelatinous nucleus inside of it, and then it also provides that disc-like shape that can absorb the impact of each step or of gravity. We see here that if we have a disc herniation, okay, so you can see here that the disc has broken out so that nucleus pulposus has actually broken through the wall of that annulus fibrosus, and what it does is it causes a herniation where you can see that it's bulging out the side like that. Okay. This is just a diagram of what it looks like. And then here we have our vertebral ligaments. Okay, so our supraspinaeus ligament, our ligamentum flavum, our intraspinous ligament. We here have our annulus fibrosus and nucleus pulposus, our anterior longitudinal ligaments, our intervertebral discs, our intervertebral foramens, and then our sectioned body of the vertebra, and our inferior articular process. Now, hopefully by now, what we're doing is that we're seeing these, and before we would have seen them, and these words would have meant nothing to us based on what the words are. But now, hopefully, what we're starting to see is we're starting to see that actually a lot of these words are giving us the information on where it's located based on the word. Okay, so if we have a word supra means superior. Okay, so what that means is our supraspinous ligament is the ligament that sits on top of the spine, the spinal process. Okay, so supraspinaeus ligament, it's the ligament that sits on top of the spinal process, which is this area here, right? It's the part that you can feel along your back. Inter, obviously international. Inter means between two. So if it's an intervertebral disc, it's a disc that's going to be sitting in between each of the vertebrae. We have the intervertebral foramen, which is that area that has a free space that allows for the spinal cord to make its way through. We have our annulus fibrosus and our nucleus pulposus, okay, and we've just gone through those discs in between the vertebra. This is the body of the vertebra that is a weight bearing. Here we have the anterior longitudinal ligament. Now, if it's anterior, again, meaning at the front, longitudinal is running longitudinal, just like the plane, the longitudinal plane. Okay, so running lengthways, and ligament connecting bone to bone. And then here we have the posterior longitudinal ligament, which means it's on the backside of that region. And again, longitudinal ligament running lengthways of the vertebrae, and ligament being bone to bone. Our intraspinous ligament, so we have our spinal process. So if we have our supraspinous ligament, which sits on top, and then we'll have our intraspinous ligament, which will sit in between the two spines. And then our inferior articular process would be the bone that sits inferiorly to the spinal column. Right, so hopefully what we're getting now is we're starting to see that there are words, and within that word, if we break it down, it actually gives us all the information that we need: posterior, anterior, supra, inferior, inter, etc. Vertebral. Okay, so we've discussed those. Okay, so in the spinal column, lastly, we'll just go through the first two. Okay, we'll go through the first three. Okay, so what we have is we have C1. So remember, if we go back to the start, if we go back to up here, we have C1 to 7. Now, our C1 is also known as Atlas. Now, Atlas was a god, and sometimes you might have seen Atlas. He's standing like this, and he has the world on his shoulders. Okay, and that represents, the world represents our skull. Okay, and what Atlas does is Atlas is the vertebrae that holds the globe, or holds the skull, to the body. Right, so Atlas has no body and has no spinous process, which means we can't actually feel it. So that's up in the top of our neck. It's anterior and posterior. It has anterior and posterior arches and 2 lateral masses. So we can see here we have 2 lateral. So this is medial through the middle, 2 lateral masses. The superior surface of the lateral masses articulate with the occipital condyles. So remember, we talked about those 2 condyles that sit in the base of the skull. Okay, those hollowed out areas, they sit on top of here, right? And the superior surfaces of the lateral mass articulate with these articulations allow for the flexion and extension of the head and neck. So that means the flexion and extension of the head and neck is because of this vertebrae. And then we have the next one, which is axis. So axis, just like following an axis, so being able to turn left and right. The second vertebrae is called axis for that purpose. Okay, the dens, or the odontoid process, which projects superiorly from the body. The dens is cradled in the anterior arch of the atlas, and it provides a pivot and rotation for the atlas of the head. So this dens area attaches to the inferior side of the atlas above it, and because of that dens, that odontoid process, it allows for that twisting and turning movement that our head is able to do. Okay, because of that point. And then you can see that it has everything else like it does. It has the articular surfaces, it has a main body, it has transverse processes, it has its lamina, it has a spinous process. This is where we see the first spinous process, and our transverse foramens. And that's all for today.
Hey, still class.
Yeah, just that